Welcome to the Lansdowne Library's Geek Out podcast.
We geek out about just about anything.
I'm your co-host, David.
And I'm your other co-host, Jeff.
And today we are joined by...
Alex.
We have a very special topic today. Today we're talking about Tolkien, or J.R.R. Tolkien, or that guy that did those movies or wrote the books about the movies coming from the 2000s. What movies are those? We'll ask Alex to kick us off with, what did Tolkien write?
So, Tolkien is most known for his works of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Of course, he wrote more than that, but those are the famous ones and will be the primary focus of what we're going to be talking about today.
Are we including, and I don't think I've ever said this correctly, the Silmarillion or...
Silmarillion,
there we go.
Yeah.
I feel like that's always a title that takes me at least 3 tries.
It is a little tricky, especially when you see it. It's a little daunting, but yeah, we will be talking about that a little bit, but it's not only intimidating to pronounce the name, sometimes it's rather intimidating to read, and that's coming from somebody who loves Tolkien, so it is a bit dense. We'll start with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and if you want more, there is more, so, yeah.
I think we should definitely get into it, seeing as how the Rings of Power?
Rings of Power,
the Amazon series has come out, so there's a renewed interest in the world of Middle-earth.
Right. Which is based off of some of the stories from the Silmarillion, in fact. They've been changed and expanded upon, but yeah.
Having read that years ago, I feel like you kind of have to. That's less a book of stories and more a book of ideas and history and lore.
And that's true, too, because a lot of the later works of Tolkien were expanding the stories in the Silmarillion into full-fledged stories. And then his son, Christopher Tolkien, polished up those notes and then published them, so you can actually read a few of those stories more fleshed out, published by Christopher Tolkien.
Well, why Tolkien? What's his significance among all the works of fantasy?
There's a few things. First, Tolkien is the creator of the fantasy genre as we know it. There wasn't really a term for fantasy before Tolkien. They called them fairy tales, just like they would children's books, because that's really the only target audience for that genre at that time. There was, of course, mythology still, and so there was the academic side and then the children's side, and there wasn't anything in between. And so Tolkien was trying to bridge that gap and bring something new. So when you think about fantasy as a genre, it is something that is Tolkien's creation. So we owe every modern fantasy to Tolkien in that sense. There were a lot of stigmas and prejudices against that at that time. They thought it was very childish, and even we have an interview with Tolkien where the interviewer asked him why he spent so much time making up a language that no one ever spoke. And he said, "Don't you think somebody of your academic standards have better things to do with your time than to make up a make-believe language?" And just this very negative, condescending question, whereas nowadays, there's the Klingon language, there's the Dothraki language. People take great pride in creating these massive worlds for their fantasy books, and that was started by Tolkien.
Generally, he is kind of like the grandfather of world building in that regard. It's not just that he was creating a world, but its history, its languages.
Mm-hmm. He was very, very dedicated to that because, again, if you think about fairy tales, they are very much a snapshot story. They don't tell you about anything really before or anything really after or anything in the periphery. They're just a little quick glimpse into something else.
Usually with the ending of "and then they lived happily ever after."
Right.
About as much as you're getting for a real conclusion there.
But, even though I do work at a library and I am a fan of a lot of books, I still do know that the first, the originator of genres aren't always good. Sometimes they're fun or they're important, but, like personally, the book Frankenstein, which is a very, very important book. It's a classic. It started a lot in terms of...
It is essentially the first science fiction novel.
Right. I understand it's very valuable, but I don't enjoy reading it.
I'm going to have to respectfully disagree on that.
That's
but
fine.
I can understand where you're coming
Right.
from.
That's fine. My main complaint with that is the characters are a little dense.
Yeah.
So, but it is a very well-written book. It is a very important book. It's a very groundbreaking book. With Tolkien, again, there are arguments to be made, and we can talk about this as we go, about how that is boring as well. But I would say that it is still doing the same sort of things. It's setting the tones. It's setting the expectations for the genre. It's very good writing. It's a very impactful story. It's not significant just because it's the first. It's significant for its own sake, too.
You mentioned fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
Lord of the Rings is not its own entirely unique thing.
No.
What does Tolkien draw from to create these worlds?
Yeah. Which is a very important thing because it has shaped how we view fantasy, because Tolkien was he stated that he wanted to create a mythology for England. And so he drew from the mythologies of the people from England, so predominantly the Norse and Celtic mythologies. There's a lot of Arthurian influence. There's a lot of Welsh influence. The most notable stuff is the Norse stuff. He did very much like Norse mythology. And if you look at anything fantasy, that is what dominates the world. So, you get goblins. Well, goblins, again, are from these mythologies. If you go to, like Greek mythology, you don't find goblins. You have elves, you have dwarves, you have frost giants and mountain giants and dragons, although dragons are
pretty much universal.
Yeah. But they are very uniquely European dragons, Northern European dragons. And in fact, there are orcs. Tolkien didn't make up the word orc. It is an Old Norse word, I believe, either Old Norse or Old English, but it means demon. And he used it to apply it to a specific type of goblin, and now that is the standard. All sorts of fantasies have orcs in them. Or some variation there.
They certainly aren't one-to-one of Tolkien's orcs.
No.
But they are... You can see where that is the start of the framework. It's, very similar to, elves.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at elves in, say, Celtic mythology, they're not pleasant creatures.
No.
They are generally evil spirits.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, in modern fantasy, we now think of the Tolkien style of elves, where they're these glamorous, long-lived creatures.
Mm-hmm. Which he got from the Light Elves of Norse mythology, but he still does pay homage to the elves of Celtic mythology, since he is drawing from the Celtic stuff as well. With Galadriel and the imagery that she has. Even though she is good, she's still one of the Fays. You could very much compare her to Morgan Le Fay, that sort of character. So
the Wood Elves are not especially nice in The Hobbit either. They're just kind of jerks too.
Yeah.
I mean, within... In fairness, sometimes not unreasonably so.
No,
not.
But they're their own people, and even if you look at like Welsh myth or various Celtic myths, a lot of the Fey creatures just kind of have their own society,
they have their own
adjacent to it. Yeah.
If you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone, and their actions usually don't go well for mortals.
Exactly. So that is very similar to the Wood Elves. Even our pronunciation, just to see how deep-rooted Tolkien fantasy is, our pronunciation of elves and dwarves is Tolkien's pronunciation, because it was dwarfs and elves. You get the singular form with the F, and then you just add an S after it.
And of course, there are the several permutations of elf that they could have picked. They could have been Alps, they could have been pucks, brownies.
Right. Fays, they could have just been fays.
Tolkien went with elf, and now basically all fantasy reflects that.
Yeah.
With, I guess, the exception of Santa Clauses
and
the Keeblers.
Yes. So there are
those of the shelf.
Yes. Yeah.
Trixiest of.
But see, that is the most mischievous. Yeah. That's still in the realm of the children's fantasy fairy tales, which he didn't really have any impact on to most extent, because that really predates him and existed through him and that sort of stuff. Which is interesting because, the Disney movies, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, is dwarfs with the F, because it was before Tolkien's work. He did go to see that movie, actually, with C.S. Lewis, and he didn't care for it other than for the scene where she is running through the woods and the trees are all making scary faces at her.
See that influence.
Yeah. Which the other thing, if you're talking about modern fantasy and how it has evolved and what Tolkien's influences are, we do see a parallel kind of path in fantasy, which is the Greco-Roman mythologies, which Tolkien really didn't touch on. However, his good friend C.S. Lewis with the Chronicles of Narnia was extraordinarily Greco-Roman in its mythology.
Like satyrs and things like that.
And we see that continuing too as kind of a parallel, and they get combined too. And what we do see is that has expanded. If you look at, I'd say, the kind of new forerunners in fantasy are Dungeons and Dragons, Magic the Gathering, and Warcraft. And they have expanded to include other mythologies such as Egyptian, Japanese, and Slavic.
Especially in recent years for magic.
Even though that is not what Tolkien did, the idea to create worlds based off of mythologies, to create new mythologies with existing materials and make these mythologies your own, because they were initially, in the ancient world, mythologies were supposed to be your own, about your culture and your society. So that reclamation of that idea, even though in this current iteration isn't Tolkien, is Tolkien inspired.
And of course we have kind of the intentional counterpoint, when you're talking about Tolkien. A more modern, obvious comparison is Martin and his Song of Ice and Fire.
Right.
Which is kind of intentionally, I don't even want to say subverting, because I feel like that might be giving it a little more credit than it's due.
I think so, yeah. But
he's very much like, he has this opinion of Tolkien where Tolkien's works are very much, good always wins and evil always suffers. Clearly, Martin not a fan of that particular concept.
Yeah. So it is interesting, and there's definitely a movement towards creating darker stories, which I think also, even though they're darker than Tolkien set that in motion. He relied very heavily on ghosts, curses, and things of that nature, so there is a lot of dark tones. But in terms of the quote-unquote realism that George R.R. Martin tends to harp on, that's more debatable as to how real that actually is. So the idea of...
And I mean, let's be fair here. Adding realism to fantasy kind of weakens both concepts.
In some regards, yes. In other regards, it depends on how you mean it.
Yes.
Yeah, because one of the things I think about that is great about Tolkien is how realistic it is. And he is taking something that, again, was considered childish or something that the archaic man did in the ancient world, and he made it very intellectual, very modern, very realistic, So he was like, how would real people react? How would the real world develop if there was magic, if there were elves? But yes, anything can't be taken too far. And the idea, that anybody can die at a moment's notice, even these main heroes and stuff, is technically true, but also, I think, can easily be taken too far. If you look at history, even if you look at medieval history or something like that, where you think, oh, it's brutal, people die all the time, you can read many stories, actual stories of people, and guess what? They survive the whole thing. They go to multiple wars. They, have long-lasting dynasties. It happens. The other thing happens too, where entire families get decimated,
Tends not to make for quite as fun a story, though.
Yeah. So to say one is more realistic, where death is just suddenly falling upon everybody and there's this brutal overtone, is more realistic, isn't exactly accurate. It can be accurate. It can also be less accurate. There's various things that I don't want this to be a bashing of George R. R. Martin.
Yeah, for the record, while I'm not the biggest fan of especially the ending we've seen for Game of Thrones, I generally enjoy it conceptually.
Now, to his credit, that wasn't his fault.
No, it wasn't.
I mean,
they branched off.
We don't know, because they supposedly had his notes, but that's a tangent for another podcast.
Yeah. And having his notes doesn't mean...
won't end that way now.
Yeah, he has the benefit of seeing...
That was a real big brain.
Yeah.
Do people like this? No? Okay. Well,
that's why he's taking so long to finish. He's like, oh, wait.
Nope, turns out this is terrible.
Yeah.
Well, that's funny. It's if Game of Thrones is supposed to be dark, like, whenever I think of fantasy, especially this, he's probably on a... Because I somewhat agree with his arguments about Tolkien definitely being lighter, although his were originally stories he told to his kids, so they're going to be lighter. But also it's like, okay, you're writing, it's kind of dark, okay, there's some things that you're doing kind of edgy, but then I'm like, but you want dark Warhammer.
Yeah.
Like that is dark.
Yeah.
The whole premise of the Vermintide, which is like super bubonic plague and rats everywhere, is way worse than like anything.
To be fair, that at points gets dark to the points of it just looping back around to being comical. Like things are so bad, it's almost funny.
And that's why 40K is supposed to be satirical.
Yes.
You're not supposed to take all this seriously.
Yeah. But there's also... So, George R. R. Martin said one of the inspirations for him was in the Fellowship of the Ring when Gandalf dies. I don't know if we need to be giving spoilers. I
really hope not.
Yeah. So,
even if you haven't read the books, the movies are like 20 years old.
Yeah.
And are pretty solid. Like,
yes, they are very good.
They hold up well, specifically the live-action one. The Rankin Bass movies. The Hobbit is fantastic.
Yes, I love The Hobbit.
The Lord of the Rings is 2 movies that needed to be 3.
Yeah, they're still fun.
They're fascinating as somebody who just generally loves animation. They are a unique and wonderful little thing.
I would love to do a lot more about all the fantasy cartoons from the 70s that Lord of the Rings inspired, but let's continue on.
That can be its own topic. That could be its own several topics.
Oh, yes.
But the thing is, though, he said, though, that he was then disappointed when Gandalf came back and said that Tolkien made a mistake in doing that. In that sense, I think he misunderstands the point of the book. And people who say that, because I'm using Martin as a fall guy here because he's a public figure saying it. This is a very prolific view.
This is especially in the early 2000s and 2010s, is that there was a very brutalistic tend in fantasy media.
Yeah.
And no, it is not Martin's fault, but he's the best known of these people because his works were good enough that they made it out of that era.
Right. The thing is that Tolkien goes for something, he does, as I was saying before, he does try to make things realistic, but he also goes for symbolism and archetypes. Now, there is a famous quote from Tolkien where he said that he hates allegory, and so we have to be very careful about what we mean by this. It's semantics a bit. What he hates is things having direct parallels where this symbolizes this. Because that is a very narrow view of his stories, and he doesn't want to communicate one message. He wants to communicate universal truth. So what he does is he uses archetypes. And archetypes are features of stories. They're characters that are universal truths, universal aspects of humanity. And they've been being used in stories since stories. They have incredible history and thousands of years of meaning packed into them, and so to use them flippantly and just kill something off has huge ramifications. So, For example, Gandalf is an archetype of a divinely sent guide. So for a divinely sent guide to die means that that divine guidance is missing from your life. For it to stay dead means that that divine guidance stays dead and never is impacting your life anymore. And so if that were the story that Tolkien wanted to tell, something of like losing faith perhaps, of rejecting God or God rejecting you or something like that, that is a way to do that. That's not the story he was trying to tell. He wanted to tell a story of guidance, and so he brought it back. Now, again, it's not a one-to-one symbolism there. You can't just say, oh, Gandalf represents this end of story. He represents many things. And so it's not what I just said there isn't the only answer to that question. There are many, many answers because of the fluidity of how Tolkien is telling the story. He wants it to speak to everyone where they are. So Gandalf may represent something completely different than divine guidance. I use divine guidance as the example because that's much more traditional in the archetypal format, and also Tolkien himself was religious. But it doesn't mean that that's exclusively how it has to be interpreted. However you want to interpret it, it is Gandalf represents some sort of a guide. And so in his absence, there is an absence of guidance. It is a period of loss, of confusion. So whatever that means to you is how Gandalf is to be interpreted by you. So it's a much more open, it's a much more universal way of communicating when you use archetypes. So that way, Arya Stark represents Arya Stark. Boromir, however, represents a huge amount of things. He represents, the human condition. He represents ambition. He represents all sorts of things. So everybody has some sort of Boromir in their life. Not necessarily everyone has an Arya Stark in their life. And that's not to say that therefore one is better than the other. It's a different form of storytelling. And so to apply the rules of the one to the other, or vice versa, is incorrect.
That's without opening the whole can of worms of what exactly is Gandalf from a story standpoint.
Right.
Gandalf dying is questionable if that's really possible for
right.
certain. And,
yeah.
That's I suppose one of the other big things is that I both like and dislike about Tolkien's writing is magic is very vague.
It is.
Which feels right for magic, but there are times when you're unclear, especially more so in The Hobbit, I feel like, than in the Lord of the Rings, where I'm not entirely certain Gandalf can do magic in The Hobbit.
It's interesting in the Peter Jackson films, both the Hobbit trilogy and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he really downplays the magic of Gandalf and the other wizards. He interprets it in different ways. So, for example, you have Saruman when he sends the fires to Helm's Deep. In that, they interpret that as black powder. And so it is a very naturalistic interpretation. Whereas if you look at that animation we were talking about before, it is literal balls of fire flying through the sky. How Tolkien writes it, you can take it either way. So it is very vague, and it allows you to interpret it in much more naturalistic ways or much more fantastical ways. And it is also interesting just the idea of Tolkien being the founder of fantasy. He's still in some ways, light fantasy. Because if you think about any of the things I mentioned already, Magic the Gathering, Dungeons & Dragons, even Warhammer stuff, there are just magical beings. You can't walk 2 feet without stepping on like some magical tome that...
Wizards have, to use D&D as the example, it's not only do wizards cast spells, but here's the list of spells and the things they need to cast them and the levels.
And you
different
go down.
Types of wizards, sorcerers and warlocks have different things.
And any decent city will have a shop that will sell you those things.
Yeah.
Well, I think I can sort of explain, or at least explain why black powder was sort of Jackson's interpretation. Mm-hmm. And there's a few things to look at. So Tolkien drew the things we want to look at with Tolkien and Peter Jackson definitely picked up on this was, one, Helm's Deep was, and it's a little debated between that and the battle minus Tirith in Return of the King. But both of those battles are sort of loosely based on the Siege of Vienna. At which, when, oh boy, I can't remember who they were. No, it was the, let's say Saracens would have done, but I'm fairly certain that's not the answer. But essentially, the walls of Vienna were nearly breached by mines that were dug under and placed below, and they attempted to destroy them to let the soldiers into the city. And the siege was then broken up by the Polish hussars, the winged hussars, very much like the horse riders at the end of the Battle of Helm's Deep. People say minus Tirith. I tend to disagree, but so he was looking at that, but also gunpowder as sort of an invention makes a lot of sense when you look at Tolkien being very against industry. Tolkien was not about machinery. He wasn't anti-science but he was much more about, I'm going to go in the woods, I'm going to smoke a pipe, and I'm just going to enjoy nature.
And it is, and I actually, even though when I first read Tolkien, I definitely interpreted it as balls of fire flying through the sky type magic, and tend to prefer that in most situations. I especially don't mind and even like it in Saruman's character, because Saruman is the industrialized character. Yeah. Everything he does is industrialized. And Tolkien, speaking to what Dave just said, shows his distaste for that, where the trees literally rise up and tear down the industry.
Best scene in that movie.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
So, yes. So there are, and again, there's nothing that has just one interpretation in Tolkien, but this one is still a very strong showing of what Tolkien's beliefs are, and where he has this message that he's trying to give, where he's like what he believes in terms of nature and the goodness of it and in preserving it. But that's also where you get one of the best things about Tolkien is the layered effect. So you can look at something like the fires of Orthancs destroying Helm's Deep, and you can say, oh, well, it's the Battle of Vienna. Oh, well, it's industrialization. Oh, well, it's this. Oh, well, it's that. And the answer to which one it is yes. Yeah. It does represent all of these. And it's not like, oh, well, it's up to your interpretation. It is, but it was done intentionally. Tolkien wasn't just like, I don't know what this means, let them decide. He was intentionally trying to make it mean as many things as possible.
It's the difference between, sort of this intentional form of storytelling and something like... Gonna keep talking about a lot of people with letters and names, but J.J. Abrams famously would just make plots with no answers and just hope people would figure it out by the time it was relevant.
And even, like another famous author with letters is J.K. Rowling, who did similar things, who would come up with, again, she's more in the legacy of Tolkien, though she does go for children's stuff. She definitely does the world building and tries to make this thing. But there is a lot of stuff where you can tell, especially in the earlier books, that are later contradicted or just like, you didn't really think this out, did you? But you've heard feedback, and so you just... The
entire existence of the Time Tuner as a thing is just... It solves literally every problem that ever existed. Yeah. How is this a thing?
And it even seems like Horcruxes were a later thought of hers, and she's just retroactively applied that to other things. So,
and what is the Horcrux other than the Ring of Power?
Right, yeah. Which the Ring of Power has found its way into so many stories for so many different thing.
Again, in Dungeons and Dragons, we would refer to that as a phylactery. What every lich has to keep them alive.
Yeah.
Well, alive in quotation marks.
Yeah.
And it's from, Tolkien himself got the idea from the Ring of the Nibelungen.
Right. Which is the thing that I've had when I've talked to other people about Tolkien, is people are always like, well, Tolkien didn't make that stuff up. Yes, I know.
Nobody has made up anything in at least 5,000 years. Yeah. There's nothing new under the sun.
So he is the the grandfather of modern fantasy, but no, he didn't originate any of this stuff. But he brought it to the modern era, because most of us wouldn't know about that ring unless you were a fan of opera, really.
Yeah.
Or an academic who really liked ancient literature, medieval literature.
Unlikely to come up in your day-to-day, whereas...
Right.
And, yeah, the vast majority of people would find out about it because of Lord of the Rings or something else that specifically references it.
Yeah. Which he also brought Beowulf to the forefront, because in academia it was actually rather snubbed before him, because it was in the transitional period between Norse mythology and Christianity, and is a very mixed muddling of both. And so a lot of academics dismissed it because of that, saying you can't get an accurate depiction of either. However, Tolkien said that's why it's brilliant, because it shows that transitional period.
Shows them as they're trying to convert themselves.
Yeah. And so then you have, now Beowulf is very commonly taught in schools, whereas it wasn't prior to Tolkien. Yeah, there was a movie made about it. Wasn't a good movie,
not a good movie.
But, this is, you get even like the movie Troy. Mythology movies are now being presented as exciting epics, as opposed to something that you study in school.
Yes, as opposed to your homework.
Exactly.
Well, I would even argue it's with Hollywood that's been the case for a long time.
Yeah.
The old Jason and the Argonauts with the claymation.
Yeah.
The Ten Commandments.
Oh, yeah.
That is ridiculously hyped, and I'm not going to comment on my opinion on the movie, but it definitely was, this huge thing. It's been pushed. People still watch it around Easter. Yeah. It's a giant spectacle. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It's not the first spectacle film, but it is probably like one of the first successful ones, one that stood the test of time after the fact.
And again, these sorts of things could probably have risen to the prominence without Tolkien at some point in time. Obviously, he didn't inspire the Bible or anything like that, nor did he inspire the Western civilization's love for the Bible. But he did show that epics of ancient texts can be entertainment. And it is okay to like Troy, where there's, a wooden horse and there's gods and, doing crazy things. It's not just for kids. It's not just for ancient civilizations. It can be for us too. So we kind of got onto other things, but I did want to steer us back to the archetypes and story elements with another kind of very famous misconception about Tolkien, which of course is the Eagles. And they're called, the Deus Ex Machina, which, if people are not familiar, is a term that we won't worry about the literal translation, but God in the machine, which is referring to having actors lowered onto a stage.
To be God fixing it.
Right. But the meaning of it, the symbolic meaning of Deus Ex Machina, means a solution to come from nowhere. Just an unforeseen source provides a solution to your problems. And that is often attributed to the Eagles. Whereas it's actually not the case, because there's a lot of symbolism, there's a lot of archetypes. Because first, you have to look to the origins of Deus Ex Machina, and it is in the Greco-Roman plays. And yes, there were stories where the gods did just come out of nowhere, but more frequently than that, the gods came because of the deeds of the hero. There's the Greek proverb, God helps those who help themselves. A lot of people misattribute that to the Bible. We actually have it from Aesop, and he probably didn't make it up, but still. It's a Greek phrase, and you see it in the plays, where a hero will do everything he can to solve the problem and will still just come just short of succeeding. But the gods will reward that effort by bumping him just over the edge. And that's what Tolkien is paying homage to, where the deed is actually already done. The ring is destroyed. Spoilers, again.
I mean, that's true for the Lord of the Rings, but the Eagles do also fill a sort of similar role in the Hobbit.
They do, yes. However, in that sense, also, you can say, oh, well, see, they needed the Eagles to win. However, Tolkien arranged it so that they needed the Eagles to win. He could have said, and the elves, men, and dwarves were enough. And there you go. That's the end of the battle.
That's very true.
So it's not like, oh, if he didn't have the Eagles, he wouldn't have had a solution. He made that situation the way it was.
It's no birds.
So, and that's the other thing. So, Tolkien was in World War I as a soldier in the Battle of Somme, I believe it was.
Yep.
And then he worked in decoding in World War II. So he was very familiar with these wars, and they were huge inspirations for these works. And what nation, represented by an eagle, came in at the end of the battle to help win the war?
I agree, but I will mention Germany also had an eagle.
Yes.
It's true.
A lot of nations have an eagle.
It's a very popular bird.
It is.
Clearly,
Thanks to Rome.
We should have gone with Franklin's idea and had the turkey.
Yes.
Nobody uses the turkeys.
It would have been great if there were giant turkeys at the end of Lord of the Rings.
Oh, it would be a wrap. No, the armies of Mordor would stand no chance against the 10-foot turkey. It's like the, would you rather fight?
Like a duck-sized horse or a horse-sized duck?
Yeah.
I would not fight that
horse-sized turkey. Yeah. It's done.
Yeah. But see, that does go, not the turkeys, the eagle, and being part of Nazi Germany as well as the U.S., shows that it's never a 1-to-1 ratio. So, did the eagles symbolize the U.S.? Maybe. They certainly can, but they symbolize so much more than that. They don't symbolize Nazi Germany, but...
that's more the goblins and the orcs.
Yeah.
And to be fair, Lord of the Rings does predate that, if I'm not mistaken.
Predate what?
Predate the Second World War. Because
he was working on it then, but it wasn't published then. I think it got published after.
I thought I remember.
But maybe not.
I remember a story. I'll fact check it.
Let's do a quick fact check on that one.
I will say that he was definitely much more intimately involved in World War I, and that was much more impactful in his life as a whole, because he went with a bunch of his friends and was the one to come back.
Yeah.
There was a huge impact, including one of his aides, someone named Sam, who was always there to help him while he was terribly ill in the trenches.
Publication date, you are correct. It was 1954.
Okay.
It was the official publication. Most of it was written during World War II.
Yeah.
I was mistaking it with The Hobbit, which was written in 1937 and did actually gain a lot of popularity, especially in Germany at the time.
Right. And in fact, here's another cool thing, because it was based so heavily on Norse mythology, and Nazi Germany was trying to, recreate the Aryan race. Hitler was very interested in Tolkien and reached out to him. Tolkien responded saying, "You don't know what you're talking about. You're using Aryan in the wrong context." Just going down and just tearing him apart in every feasible way he could. So, yeah, he was not a fan.
Yeah. Let it be on record. Tolkien, not a fan.
He's not a fan of Hitler.
I mean, Nazi Germany. For some authors in that time period, it's honestly a thing you have to put on record.
It's true. He was...
He's got receipts.
Yeah. He was... Hitler before World War II was very popular.
Yeah.
And not just in Germany.
There were American rallies.
As the Square Garden.
Not that we have to go down that whole rabbit hole, because that is, again, another topic in and of itself.
That's more of a problem that the Warhammer fans have to deal with right now.
Yeah.
Let's leave them to that horror.
Yeah. So there's a huge depth of meaning that you can get from each action of Lord of the Rings. So not that you have to assume that Tolkien always knows what he's doing at all the time.
The obvious counterpoint will and always is Tom Bombadil.
Which I would say has a very important role in the story. Because if you look at the most powerful people in Lord of the Rings, the most powerful good guys in Lord of the Rings, you have the White Council, you have Elrond, you have Gandalf, you have Galadriel. How do they all interact with the ring? They're all terrified of the ring. they won't touch the ring. Galadriel uses the temptation of a ring as a test to see if she's worthy to go to paradise. That's how much of an impact it has on her. Elrond is like, it has to be destroyed. There's no question.
Yeah. Do not even touch this.
Yeah.
What is wrong with you all?
Yeah. Whereas Tom Bombadil is a good guy, and he doesn't care about the ring at all. It says that he is older than the ring. It has no power over him whatsoever. It is a trifle to him. And so that shows that a force of good can exist without being afraid of the forces of evil. Whereas all the other forces of good you see in the entire book are all terrified of the ring. Here is a good that can exist without fear. And so there is a huge symbolic meaning. And again, that doesn't have to be the only interpretation of Tom Bombadil, but that is an interpretation, a symbol. And so to get rid of that, you can very easily tell the story without that.
Yeah.
And the movies do a wonderful job telling the story, and they make no reference to Tom Bombadil. But I have also heard people apply the Stephen King quote, "You have to kill your darlings," meaning that Tolkien should have axed that part to trim down his book. I disagree with that. I think Tom Bombadil belongs in the book and tells a very important part of the story.
Tom Bombadil and Fatty Lumpkins are absolutely crucial to Lord of the Rings. I will not have anyone slander their good name.
Yeah.
I do say this as somebody who finds the character amusing.
Yeah.
It is such a weird, and I guess
it is a very strange aside.
It doesn't. But while it tells us an interesting thing about the world, it does not really tell us anything in the story. It
doesn't progress the storyline. You don't have to say that Tolkien is perfect or always knows what he's doing and always gets it right. But to...
name an author that does.
Yeah, exactly. And even, another counterpoint is he does change things. He rewrote The Hobbit after he wrote Lord of the Rings because he had further developed the world. And so he needed to make adjustments because he is making it up as he goes along. It's just more well thought out than other books that phrase would apply to. So just to say, oh, well, he's just using Deus Ex Machina, or he's just using good guys versus bad guys, is a very simplistic view, and you should assume, I think, that there's more to it. Now, that doesn't mean that there always is, but I think it's safe to start with the assumption that there's probably more to it.
Well, and before we I just want to add, that's what makes, I think that's the point he was trying to make, at least with the Hobbits. Gandalf trusts them with the ring because Tolkien saw the hobbits as more the common man, but not, sort of they were just farmers that had a very nice, kind of a communal lifestyle.
They're the Homer Simpsons of Middle-earth.
In
a little bit
smarter,
but
less,
it's that kind of...
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. More simple. More kind-hearted.
Depends what season we're discussing. I'm thinking more early Simpsons where he is overall a good person that's, just not super impressive. Just a regular guy.
Yeah. And that's like the comparison of, you bring up a White Council, they don't want to touch the ring. The way you could read that, and definitely it was somewhat written like this, it's not the only interpretation, but you could look at that as the generals not wanting to do the dirty work of the soldiers. But who are the soldiers that this is what they're doing, this is what they have to do? It's Frodo and Sam, which they get all the way there. They're likened to soldiers, just normal, simple people that are brought into this huge thing that's encompassing the world that they have no part in.
Right.
And that's ultimately why they're able to repel the ring so much. Even Sam at one point, he kind of looks at it and doesn't quite Tom Bombadil, look at this thing. Yeah. See you later, kids. But he's definitely like, yeah, I got other things to do. Right. I don't really want to listen to this.
He has his own little garden. And that's why, actually, in just comparing how the hobbits get involved in the action is against their will, which is one of the things that actually the Peter Jackson Hobbits I really didn't like. There's a lot of things I didn't like about the Peter Jackson Hobbit.
Breaking it into 3 movies.
Right.
My go-to is it's not a long enough story for it.
No, it's not. One of the earliest changes, chronologically speaking, in the story is he has Bilbo choose to go on the adventure. Whereas in the book, he is shoved out the door and carted off to go on an adventure.
No choice in the matter.
So it is this thing that's just out of your control. And again, not that one story is better than the other, because there are people who choose to go on their adventures and there are people who don't. Tolkien did not choose because he was drafted into going to World War I. And another thing about World War I, in talking about the generals, is that is when a lot of new technology was coming about, a lot of new styles of warfare that a lot of well-entrenched legacy generals had no clue how to adapt to. And so there was a huge upheaval of these generals who had, the long-lasting dynasties of nobility giving orders that were just stupid because they didn't know how to deal with it. For example, quite frequently still trying to do cavalry charges towards entrenched enemies. Perhaps that sounds familiar in Lord of the Rings, where cavalry charges a group of entrenched, or in what I'm referring to, fortified enemies, and they all get shot down. That was very, very common in World War I because people insisted on doing it the way that they knew how to do it instead of developing new things. And then Tolkien used that, and there is a scene where that happens. In the movies, it has Pippin singing over it. Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. So the idea of just being swept up, being the everyman. The hobbits are the everyman. Being swept up into a world where you just don't understand and you can't cope, but you have to.
Well, once you're on that road, there's not really a chance to turn back.
Which they talk about that too, quite frequently. And they don't leave, the characters aren't stuck the whole time. Well, okay, Bilbo does the whole time being like, oh, miserable me, I got swept up into this. But you do see with Frodo and Sam and the others, they get to a point where they do get to choose. They get thrown into it, and then they go to Rivendell, and then they get to choose to continue. And so you do get both, actually. And so there is a lot to read into and a lot to see.
Here's the obvious big difference there is, Bilbo is being more or less conscripted to go steal treasure from a dragon, where Frodo and Sam, it's, hey, if this thing doesn't happen, basically everyone is going to die.
Right. Which there are, again, not to draw too close parallels with this and the two world wars, because though those were influenced, it's not exclusive. A lot of people in England at the start of World War I were like, why are we getting involved? This is not our fight. In fact, Germany is a closer ally than France has ever been. So why are we defending France from Germany? Whereas in the Second World War, it was much more like, this is a problem. They're
actively bombing us.
Yeah. So there is, again, the different stories and different perspectives from different times.
There was a movie a couple of years back about Tolkien. Not biopic, but I don't know what you would call that, but it was like about his life, but it wasn't a documentary or anything. Really neat scene that they did where he's, in the trenches, he's on the battlefield, and there's smoke and fire and gas and all this, but the neat thing is what they did with it was they took the liberty of, all right, guy with a horse rides by, Tolkien kind of you can see like the ring wraiths in that, there's fire, you see the dragons, and that's because, if you really want to talk about Tolkien's works on a more scholarly level, you got to bring up the fact of how influential that was on his life, which it terribly was. He had, I forget what college it was. He came from some prestigious school that he came from. He went to college, got out, got conscripted, and he had, I want to say, a group of 5 friends, and of them, only he and one of them came back. Everybody else perished. And it influenced his writing. You see it there. I feel like if you can talk about Lord of the Rings lore, but if you transition to talking about Tolkien, you got to bring up the World Wars. And you lived it.
And it's very, very likely, just based off of common sense and then based off of his writing, that he dealt with PTSD. And
that the writing is his way,
his way of coping and walking through those things.
If you want a reason why this is a story in which good triumphs over evil, it's because, if you lived through both world wars, that's the story you would want to read.
And even, you could say, again, an interpretation, Well, that is the theme of this one.
Yeah.
The Morgul blade that stabs Frodo bothers him way after the war. And so it is a physical sickness that he gets. And so it is kind of a PTSD that he is struggling with. And what's interesting is that there isn't a quote-unquote solution for that. He never gets cured of that. There is the cure in that he goes to the White Shores, but the White Shores is kind of symbolic of heaven. Yeah. So he dies. That's his solution. That sounds much more morbid than is intended, but...
It's less that he chooses to die, and more it's like, hey, you can be here and suffer, or you can go to heaven, essentially.
Right.
Which, that's a can of worms I don't know if we really want to get into.
We don't have time for all that. This is the introduction to Tolkien.
Yeah, we are coming up on time.
Yeah.
So, closing thoughts. Let's go with, why in your opinion? What do you like about Tolkien that you'd say everybody else should read this because I like this?
Mm-hmm. It is a little bit difficult to say everybody should read something that I like, but yeah.
Your mileage on anything can vary. But
if I may speak a little candidly, this is one of the more digestible things.
Yeah.
No offense.
True. Yeah. No, for sure. It can be a hard sell because I do think that despite everything, fantasy is still very much in the mainstream, but I think there is still a stigma attached to some of it where certain people will be like, well, that's for kids. And so there are plenty of people who don't enjoy fantasy. And so for them to be sold on Tolkien is very, very difficult. It might not be for you depending on what your interests are. I will say, again, Tolkien his influence has spread far beyond fantasy itself. Science fiction owes a lot to him. Superhero genre owes a lot to him.
Just look at most of the depictions of Sauron and, Magneto, Doctor Doom.
Yeah.
Most of Kirby's villains take a fair bit of inspiration from it.
There is even a Marvel villain named Sauron, who's a pterodactyl for some reason.
He doesn't want to cure cancer. He wants to turn people into dinosaurs.
Yeah.
I don't support the first half, but I very much support the second.
Well, I guess it's because, it's
because he's soaring, yes. That's
what, is it S-O, or is it just,
it's spelled the same as in...
So like dinosaur.
Yeah. Sauron.
Yeah.
I see what you're doing.
But... Even Led Zeppelin credits Tolkien as one of their inspirations. So to be like, I'm above fantasy, or fantasy's not really my thing, check it out. Maybe it will change your mind because it has huge, wide-reaching influence. But what I would say is the main sell, because I do like fantasy, I like the story, I like the world, but the main sell is again, the archetypes is speaking to human characteristics. It's speaking to the human condition. It's talking about how to deal with stuff that comes up in life. And sometimes it's dramatic things, sometimes it's little things. And that's why the ubiquity of Tolkien is so great, because you don't have to have experienced the same things Tolkien has experienced to get the same message that he is talking about. None of us is going to go through 2 world wars, I hope.
Yeah, I'm really not on that one.
We'll try. None is in reach at the moment, but it's not likely that we're going to have the amount of suffering that he had, but we do have the same types of struggles. One of the main struggles represented in Lord of the Rings is that of temptation, or to use a less religious word, addiction.
Yeah.
And you can say, I'm not a drinker, I'm not a smoker, I don't do drugs. There are addictions to everything.
You probably know somebody that is,
right,
just statistically.
Not that Tolkien has the cure for all of these things, but he dealt with issues and is talking about them. And he talks about them in a way that is very relatable and very informative and comforting. Each of the characters, again, is an archetype. They represent different qualities, and so they represent things that work and things that don't work. And so it's like, if you want to have the ambition of Boromir, that will work in some regards, but not in others. And he shows that by the character succeeding in battle or failing in battle. And so it is an analysis of humanity, and it's an analysis of the struggles that you as a person go through. And it, again, gives great respect to those struggles. Because if you say, it's like, oh, I don't know, and just say something you're facing, you got fired at your job. Let's say that. That is a very bad thing to deal with. But if you wrote a story about, it's like, you tell somebody I got fired at my job, then it's like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And that's kind of the end of it. But if you change that and be like, I don't know, you turn your enemies into literal giants, you turn them into literal dragons. You're like, this is a literal mountain that I have to climb. He uses metaphor and makes them literal in the stories, like you have to overcome this. And so it gives the issues respect, and it's not belittling anything that you have to face. Having that epic scope and then talking about it and presenting solutions, presenting things that don't work, and even presenting kind of ambiguity at the end again. Like with Frodo, he has an incurable wound, and it just kind of ends with a non-solution for people who aren't ready to go to heaven. It's very, very powerful, I think, in terms of philosophy, psychology, and just humanity. That would be my sell, is that it is a story about humans. Which is perhaps an odd thing to say, but that's what it is.
I'd just like to add, if you've seen the movies but haven't read the books, especially in the case of the Hobbits, don't see the movies, just read the book. But if you love the Lord of the Rings films, the books are absolutely worth your time. There's a lot of those small moments that are just so satisfying, but aren't particularly cinematic that you get from these characters that I think really makes it worth your investment.
And again, there are moments that, depending on what type of literature you like, can be very dull. I don't personally think they're dull. The genealogies, the histories, the things like that. I eat that stuff up. It's great for me. A lot of people don't like that. And that is a matter of taste. That's not a matter of one thing being right or the other. So it may be profitable. You might enjoy it better to skip through things. I don't look down on people who skip through sections of Tolkien, or it may be good. There are great radio productions of it from the BBC that they did dramatic readings with actors doing the different characters. There are great abridged versions out there. There are ways to read it that will be lighter on the
prose.
Yeah, on the prose. So there's a version out there for you.
You can even find a Soviet version where they interpret it as industry is the good thing, and that all the orcs and goblins were totally just normal dudes and were not bad at all, and it was actually the hobbits as well. I'm not making this up either. So even from the opposite perspective, there's a version out there.
Yeah.
If for some reason you just detest nature.
No. Definitely look around. And if you have trouble looking around, come to the library and we'll help you find something.
So we are coming to the end of the episode. Alex, thank you for giving us your time and giving us a lot to think about in terms of Tolkien.
Happy to come here and talk about it.
So that's going to wrap up our episode for September. And next episode is October, so we're going to get a little creepy crawly with it. Our next topic is spiders. So if you're arachnophobic, might not be your thing, but if you're looking to conquer your fear, we have someone to talk about them in the most, I won't say fluffiest way, but definitely a way that might make you think twice about our eight-legged pals.
And if you have something that you'd like to talk with us about, you can head on over to lansdownlibrary.org/podcasts and hit the green register here button.